Please be seated. Well, friends, we are most of the way through this Easter season. I like to call it by its old-fashioned name, Eastertide, which lasts for 50 days from the day of Easter until the day of Pentecost. This is the 5th Sunday of Easter, so there are 3 more left, counting Pentecost. You can do the math. And I find myself thinking back about what I said on Easter Sunday. I remember that I talked about a messy resurrection, about how the time when Jesus in his resurrected form was walking around and appearing to his disciples and eating fish with them and appearing and disappearing and allowing them to touch his wound must have been such a confusing time for them. Wonderful, yes, but confusing and disorienting and strange and messy. And so I talked about a messy resurrection also for us, and how this time of regathering by fits and starts, gradually figuring out how to come back together into gathered community in various forms was not going to be all neat and pretty with a bow tied on it, because neither was Jesus's resurrection, and neither is any new life. And then I found myself in the middle of that messiness, and I didn't like it. And I found last Sunday afternoon in our It's Okay Not to Be Okay, our ongoing forum with Rebecca Bell, a framework that just came up, one which I had heard before and just went in one ear and out one ear. But this time arrested me because it so accurately described where I find myself right now. So I'm going to ask Callum to share with you one of 2 graphs. We don't normally have graphs in sermons, but we do today. So you should be looking at, hopefully on your live stream, an image of something by someone named William Bridges, who was a business consultant and came up with this understanding of transitions about 30 years ago. And he first described it to talk about transitions in companies, mergers, big changes that the leadership wanted to make, and how it would be that people would adopt or kind of adjust to those changes. So if you see, the vertical axis is the percentage of people, and the horizontal axis is moving through time. So if you look at the kind of beginning left-hand side of the chart in time, most people are in this phase of ending, of loss, of grief and difficulty, of letting go of the thing that was. Some people are in something that's called a neutral zone, and some people are already kind of early adopters on board with the new beginning. And as you move through that space, you kind of get to the middle of it, and a lot of people are in this neutral zone. Some people are still in the grief and the ending, and about an equal number of people are moved on to the new beginning. And as I looked at the middle of that chart with that great big neutral zone, I felt like that is messy resurrection. That is exactly where we are now. We're in this neutral zone. Something has died, an old way of life, an old worldview has come to an end. The new thing is maybe gestating, but is not yet ready to be born. And we're in this in-between space, this liminal space, this now and not yet. Well, as Bridges describes this neutral zone, I'll ask Callum to share the next chart with you. And he talks about kind of how people feel in the neutral zone and their energy throughout these 3 phases. It looks like a U, the energy, and the bottom dip of that U is right in the middle of the neutral zone. And I said, aha, that's why I feel this way, sort of confused and a loss of energy and at loose ends. Felt like I had more energy at the beginning of the pandemic when we were sort of jumping off the cliff into virtual church. And here we are trying to kind of regather and reinvent that and bring the lessons that we've learned along. And we don't yet know what the new thing will be. And that can be confusing, frustrating, difficult. And I know a lot of people are feeling that way. You ask people, even, we'll have 10 people and 15 different opinions about when and how we might possibly feel ready to come back together again. So it's a difficult time. We knew that already. But it's helpful for me, at least, to have a visual understanding of why that is. You can stop the chart sharing, Callum. Thank you. So how do we live in this neutral zone, in this liminal space, in this squishy, messy resurrection time? Somebody asked me this week, is it possible we could just maybe get through it a little bit quicker? Could we fast forward? How do we kind of get done with this part? And I said, I think actually we can't do that. I think we can't short circuit this. You look at the chart and it's moving through time. I mean, I find myself, I think, on different days, different places in the chart. Sometimes I think I'm done with the ending and the grieving, and then I have to go right back there. Other days I'm in the new beginning, and a lot of the time I'm just in this neutral zone. But I think that there's a reason for it. I think that we need to spend time there so that we ourselves can get ready for this new thing that is coming. And the word that just leapt out of the scriptures for me today about that is what I've heard described as John's favorite word, the word abiding. He says, abide in me as I abide in you. John gives those words to Jesus, and whatever you ask will be done for you. And even in 1 John, the letter from the community, John's community that we read today, the word abiding pops up. And abiding means to make one's home in. It's different from just a stay, right, or spending the night. It really means to root oneself in, to make one's home in, to pitch one's tent in God, in Jesus. That's the invitation. And I want to maybe remind you of something here that might seem super obvious, and I'm not doing that to be pedantic, but just because I need this reminder, so I thought that you might too. And that is that you've been doing this. We've been doing this. All of us have found ways over the last year that none of us could have imagined to stay rooted in God, just like the vine connect to the branches, to receive what it is that we need, right? We've learned that we need a balance between Zoom time and actual time, right? So maybe we've taken up baking or walking or gardening. We've made sure we had plenty of time to breathe the fresh air outdoors. We've savored the moments when we physically are with people. We've maybe invested or reinvested in prayer, knowing, I personally have learned that my spiritual practices and my self-care practices, I sort of used to think of them as, well, that's nice if I have time. It's like icing on the cake. Now I think of them as the pan that holds the cake, right? They're survival practices now. And I can tell when I've let them slip, when I don't do them. So you know what these things are for you, that are sustaining you, that are holding you, that are keeping you connected to what you need to just get through this time. You've done that. So I invite you to think about what those specific practices are, how it is that grace is sustaining you. And maybe it's just flipping a mental switch, stepping into the flow of grace. But whatever it is, isolate that. That's actually homework. I want you to really think about that. And then this is the Captain Obvious part. Keep doing that. Don't stop. We're in this time when we have so many more options and opportunities, and it is wonderful, and it is confusing and difficult and messy and draining and wonderful. All of that lives together, and we need these practices. We need these ways that we've learned of continuing to abide. Now more than ever, we need to be sustained by God's grace. And that really takes me to this beautiful image of the vine and the branches from today's gospel reading. It couldn't be a more perfect gospel for us here in the Napa Valley. I was thinking about that as I was jogging through a vineyard with the prunings on the ground and the new life coming out and the baby branches, and listening to a podcast on a sermon preparation for the vine and the branches. And we're so fortunate to be surrounded by this metaphor, this parable, because there couldn't be a more wonderful parable. I think you could spend your whole life unpacking this parable. And so I want to just say that there's a lot of sermons in here. There's a lot of wonderful thoughts about this parable that I'm not going to talk about today. I'm not going to talk about pruning. If you want to talk about the spiritual significance of cane pruning versus spur pruning, you can talk to my sister. I do want to just say that one thing I'm sure about is it's not about certain people being cut off and being thrown into hell. I'm pretty sure about that. But there's a lot more that you can do with the pruning imagery. I'm not going to talk about the fact that this vine is one organism, right? That we're all connected in this. And we've learned about that this year, how physically and spiritually interconnected we are in ways that we never could have imagined. What I do want to keep talking about, is abiding. So it's kind of a silly metaphor in a way. If you take Jesus's thinking along the way, think about a branch connected to the vine, and its leaves are out there, and it's got a pretty little piece of fruit, and it says, "Oh, I'm doing okay, vine. I'm just doing great over here by myself. I think I'll just cut myself off and separate myself from the vine, right? I don't need you anymore." A branch would never say that. A branch could never say that. And we know it's immediately apparent what the result would be to those pretty little fruits and leaves and the branch itself if the branch did do that. Right? But if we look at ourselves, if we look at humanity, if we look at our history, that's exactly our tendency. Right? Maybe it's because we're mobile. We can walk around and we grow up and we sort of leave the nest, as it were, but we feel like we can kind of go it on our own. In the Shack, the book and the movie, they talk about our relationship with God. We need to kill our independence in order to maintain our rootedness, our abiding in God. And this image, this parable that Jesus has given us, is a beautiful image of interdependence. And if that doesn't blow our mind, I don't know what will. Because just as the branch is dependent on the vine, so the vine is also dependent on the branches, right? There's this symbiotic relationship. And the vine grower, who Jesus says is God, the Father, is also in this symbiotic relationship because the vine itself can't survive without the vine grower. It can't be fruitful. Wild grapes are no good. But the vine grower, as we know here in the valley, is dependent on the vine, on the vineyard for his livelihood. Think about that, this interdependence. And this interdependence, this back and forth, this give and take like breathing, is actually contained within the vine itself. This is where I go and I pick my viticulturalist sister's brain for the biological spiritual truths. And what I came up with was the xylem and the phloem, right? So we kind of maybe remember that from early biology. The xylem is what draws up out of the roots the water and the minerals and the nutrients that branch needs to survive. The whole vine and the branch need that from the earth to survive. And I think about the ways that grace has sustained us in this last year, God's grace, and the ways that we've drawn on the earth itself, on spirit, on beauty, on life to sustain us, like we were talking about a few minutes ago. That's one way of abiding, right? But the other piece of that, the symbiotic piece of that, is that the branches also do something for the vine and the roots. So the phloem is what comes back down through the plant. And that takes the sugars that come from the photosynthesis on the leaves, and it takes that back into the rest of the plant, into the trunk and the roots for energy. So the vine and the branches really are dependent on one another. And if that xylem is what we draw our life, our ability to continue to persist, to sustain our lives from God, what's the phloem? What's the return? If you talk to anyone who has spent very much time in a 12-step program, they will tell you that service is life. that the only way that they've been able to sustain their sobriety or their recovery is through serving. That's a huge part of the 12 steps. And I think that gives me a clue into this return. Right? Whatever it is, our turning towards God in praise and thanksgiving, in self-surrender, in self-offering, even just in the morning when we wake up saying, God, I'm in this messy, confused place and I don't know what to do, but I'm going to give myself to you today. I'm going to put myself in your hands. It might be in stewardship. That's why stewardship, our giving back of all that we've been blessed with to God, is such a core spiritual practice. It might be in service, right? In our time and talent in the ways that we give to others. But whatever it is, I think that the phloem, right, the giving back, is just as important as what we draw out in order to help us connect and maintain our abiding in God. In the beautiful lesson from 1 John, I think that this really ought to rival 1 Corinthians 13 as the love passage, 1 John 4. There's so much there. But when John says, we have known and believe the love that God has for us, I think there's something there. If you read that whole paragraph and this whole passage, there's a lot about Jesus's God sending Jesus and Jesus' atoning sacrifice and confessing and believing that Jesus is the Son of God. But what John says is we have known and believed the love that God has for us. And so I don't think that any of that is about a litmus test. I don't think it's about sort of saying the right words about Jesus or thinking the right thing about Jesus, but that Jesus, the one who died and who rose, and throughout all of that, stayed connected to God, right? Allowed that xylem and that phloem to flow through him in any and every circumstance, is our model. It's our model of that new life, of what love looks like with skin on in any and every circumstance. And how blessed we are to have seen that, to have known at any point in our lives what love God has for us. I know that you've seen that this year, perhaps at other times in your life. Some place in your soul, you know that love that God has for you. So abide in that. Make your home in that. Surrender to that. Put all of your insurance, all of your security in that. And as we do that, we see and believe, as we entrust ourselves to the love that God has for us, we will just as naturally as the leaf on the vine begin to allow that life force to flow, begin to renew not only ourselves, but the vine, God's vineyard, and God's world. I've said these things to you in the name of our friend and our Savior, Jesus the Christ. Amen.